All right. Welcome everybody back to CHRTC 309. This, of course, once again, is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so in this lecture, we are going to be talking about religious summer camps. Now, of course, as with much of the content in this course, a lot of this information is American, um, and most of it has to do with Christians. And again, this is principally because when we look at the developed infrastructure, in places like Canada and the U.S., most of these summer camps that are religious rather than secular are going to be Christian, right? There might be Jewish or Muslim summer camps somewhere, but they're a relative rarity. So when we gather data, we're mostly getting data on Christian camps. So the goal here, right, is to see, beyond parents, beyond schools, what other kind of religious institutions might play a role in faith transmission. Okay, so I'm going to introduce a concept here. So these ideas come to us from a book called Sticky Faith, Everyday Ideas to Build Lasting Faith in Your Kids, from two researchers, Kara E. Powell and Dr. Chap Clark. And again, they did research basically on young people with the goal of kind of moving people, young people, so they're involved in particular church bodies. They wanted to move people from hemorrhaging faith to what they call sticky faith, right? And they said basically that moving people from hemorrhaging faith, right? So hemorrhaging like blood gushing out, right? That's a hemorrhage. To sticky faith basically came down to three factors, right? Relationships. And what they said is faith does not exist without community. Yeah, which is why something like spiritual but not religious often risks, what we can call the cut flower problem, right? Basically that, I've described the cut flower problem before, right? Flowers, if you cut them, they can stay nice for a little while, right? You buy your mom a bouquet of flowers at the store. You put them in a vase with some water, and they'll stay nice for maybe a week. But eventually, without the support of a kind of system and community, what's probably going to happen is those flowers are going to wither. And that, I think, is kind of the same for religious faith, right? If it's not supported by a system, it may last, right? You might say that you're spiritual but not religious, and then you go on and have kids, and you're not in an institutional setting. The chances that you're going to pass on any kind of faith to your kids is probably relatively low, right? Because you're dealing with the cut flower problem, right? There's no institutional support. As wobbly as I think institutional support in say, most religions in the West is, it still does exist for a reason. So, relationships, right? Faith doesn't exist without relationships. Parents are super important. Peers, other caring adults, big importance for young people. The second one, a genuine internalization of faith. And this is obviously really hard, right? Which includes identity formation and differentiation. Okay, so this is an interesting one. That a person developing who they are, their sense of self, internalizes faith as part of their identity, right? That they are Christian, they are Muslim, they are Jewish, they are Hindu, they are Sikh, right? And differentiation, and they sort of split off from their parents, right? So it no longer is their parents' faith, right? It's not, I don't know how else to say that. It's not their parents' faith, right? It's not that they are just now going along with what their parents say, but they're developing it for themselves, right? So this sense of differentiation is actually really important because if you're just relying on, say, your parent to drive your religious life, ultimately, if that ends up being removed, right, then that whole system kind of falls apart. And this is why, incidentally, when we've looked at things in the course, right, parents who sort of in the teenage years start to give their teenagers more choice, if you haven't had this internalization of faith and differentiation, then it can fall apart really quickly, right? There's not much supporting that infrastructure of faith at the end of the day. So you really need, if you want young people to be religious, if you're a religious person and you care about that, it has to be internalized and it has to differentiate. It has to become their own, right? It can't be an extension of their parents' faith altogether, because say their parents say, okay, you're 16 now, you're allowed to make choices as to whether you want to attend religious services or not. That can very quickly fall apart. Or, like as we saw with parental loss, if that person passes away, there can be this release from those expectations, right? And when you see people withdrawing from faith, not necessarily, I don't want to be too deterministic about this, but when we saw this kind of argument that that withdrawal of expectations, well, it might be the withdrawal of expectations leading to a decline in faith. It might be that the child of the more religious parent never sort of went through this internalization of faith, and especially differentiation, never made it their own. And that's why it's sort of not working. Okay, and the third one is incorporation of practices into everyday life. There has to be some kind of prayer practice or not prayer practice necessarily, religious practice in everyday life, right? It has to sort of permeate. If it's something that's left off to, specialized times, and this is a point that Smith makes as well, if it's just the specialized Sunday morning thing and religion has no other impact in people's lives ever, it's not going to have a tremendously huge impact. So it has to be incorporated into the practices of everyday life. Alrighty, so more data from the National Study of Youth and Religion. One day, many years from now, you will have a dream where you're listening to me, and all I will be saying is National Study of Youth and Religion, because I've said it so many times. All right, so a breakdown of the National Study of Youth and Religion data. And most of this comes out of Smith's book, Souls in Transition, which is 2009, which he wrote with Patricia Snell. There's another book, Lost in Transition, that also has some interesting data. And a little bit from Young Catholic America, where this gets discussed as well. All right, so a majority of emerging adults in Wave 3 of the National Study of Youth and Religion who were regularly practicing faith attended religious summer camp, right? So of those who attend weekly, 54% of them attended a religious summer camp. Those who went at least once, right? So one time attending a religious summer camp were significantly more religious than their peers. Of those who say faith is extremely or very important to them in their lives, 50% went to camp, right? So half, Those who read scripture alone once a week, it's a majority, a bare one, but a majority, 56%. Those who pray alone, 49% went daily, 49% went to camp. Of those who participate in small groups, 2/3, religious small groups, 2/3 went to camp, right? Of those with the highest level of religiosity, 60% went to camp. Oodalali, oodalali. And 80% of those who said they were religious in wave 1 and are still religious went to camp. Okay, so again, this might be the same kind of situation as we see with schools, right? It's entirely possible. Well, there's a couple things that we could think. So one of them is that the people who are going to religious summer camp, obviously their parents probably value religious summer camp in some way, right? Probably because they're more religious, so you're probably looking at more religious families. So I think that is worth, kind of talking about. Now, I know from reading Smith's book that, when you control for parental religiosity, summer camp still has an effect. But obviously, like you're talking about more religious people who are going to send their kids and pay to send their kids to religious summer camp. That said, like schools, it seems to, at very least, sort of have some degree of protective effect, keeping people somewhat more religious than they would be perhaps otherwise. Okay, so yeah, basically, when we talk about emerging adults who had been to camp, they were more likely, according to the data that we can find, to be part of religious communities. And again, this sticky faith study, which again is Powell and Clark from Fuller Youth Institute, just identifies basically what they call a sticky web of relationships needed to build and support faith through those emerging adult years, right? So basically, right, you need to be enmeshed in religious community for faith to thrive in the emerging adult years. When it's cut off, there's a much greater risk that people will leave faith. Now, I mean, you might think that's a good thing. Um, but let's say you wanted to identify how to get people not to be religious, right? You would break up these kinds of webs. But it's webs of relationships, right? It's social bonds. Social bonds um, are the things that both help people become religious and keep people religious. It's these tight networks of social bonds. Okay. Yeah, and for Smith, relational modeling and support are the number one factors in sustaining high levels of religious commitment during the emerging adult years, right? So you need, it's this social learning theory again, right? People learn to do faith by watching people do faith, right? It seems simple, but it's true. And the more people you have that are doing, a religious kind of faith walk in life, the more likely you are to have someone you can emulate, right? Okay, parents top that list, right? Obviously, we're going to go back to Dean. Parents matter most. Sorry, I'm tapping on the table. I shouldn't do that. It probably screws up the recording. Parents matter most. But that's not to say peers, and other caring adults don't matter. These kind of webs of community do matter in major ways. Okay, so a lot of the best research on Christian camps, right? So on religious summer camps, has been done by Sorensen. Um, so he basically identifies what he calls 5 characteristics of Christian camp, and especially like successful Christian summer camps, right? Those that tend to be good at moving faith from hemorrhaging to sticky, right? Okay, so they're faith centered. I mean, there shouldn't be any real surprise, but increasingly, right, when we do see, I think, this sort of meso level secularization that Chavez talked about, even amongst churches, right? Like, I don't want to throw stones, but I will. When we talk about, say, the Evangelical Lutheran Church or the Anglican Church or the United Church, in a lot of ways, these are institutions that have been undergoing a sort of meso-level secularization, right? They are churches, but and more secularized, right? Um, and so, I mean, when they run camps, there's a real chance that those camps might be less faith-centered, right? So faith-centered, right? That faith is the reason that you are at camp, right? All of the fun activities are there to support that mission, but the mission is faith, right? So there is this, I don't know how this works at every single summer camp, but certainly the ones I've sort of looked at, right? What does a daily kind of routine looks like? It's like chapel in the morning, right? First after breakfast, right? There's some kind of worship service, then activities, many of which are sort of faith oriented. Um, and then, fun activities, zip lines and the such, and then, some kind of chapel event in the evening, and then, usually late day games, campfires, and some kind of religious cool down at the end of the day, right? Whether it's like scripture reading or discussion with camp leaders, something like that. Right, but faith-centered, right? That's a typical schedule I've seen. It's both Protestant Catholic camps that I've sort of, looked at what their outlays look like. All right, so a safe space, right? They are a safe space. And this is really important, right? Like, it is obviously impossible for people to grow, for people to take risks, to internalize ideas in a space they don't feel safe, right? If you're on guard, it's not going to work. So they have to feel safe for people, right? Which means, leaders who are kind, leaders who are, affective, right? Not effective, but affective, right? They're supporting emotional needs of children, right? Um, the kindness, the support, and all of these things. That's what's key to an extent in summer camps, according to Sorensen. Relational, right? Because faith is so relational in its orientation, camps have to be relational as well. Unplugged from home, right? So they have to be disconnected from their home life and from friends, right? Which is why you see a lot of summer camps, not allowing electronics, right? They don't want smartphones or phones of any kind, especially, right? Because they should be disconnected. It should be a moment for people to unplug from the day-to-day of their lives, and just be themselves without any kind of connection or recourse to all of those other things that happen in life. And participatory, right? There needs to be an invitation for people to participate, um, in the events at camp, to take ownership of things, right? To try new things and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, so I mean, if you remember, right, when we watched the documentary, um, Soul Searching, right, and when we talked about, say, moralistic therapeutic deism earlier in the course, right, all these ideas are connected. One of the reasons this is one of my favorite courses is because I feel like I'm always doing callbacks to ideas we talked about earlier in the course, right? It's all connected. Um, so yeah, recall that when Smith and Denton talked about teenage faith, and in the documentary, and when we talked about moralistic therapeutic deism, one of the things that Smith and Denton noted is that for the most part, adolescents are very inarticulate about what they believe, right? Like, asked what they actually believe, many of them have a really, really difficult time telling you. Um, and okay, why? Why? Because they've never really been asked, right? They've never really been asked to tell you what they believe, right? And so, in order to be able to articulate what you believe about any given thing, you sort of have to take the time to sit there for long enough to actually think about it, right? It's not something, it's something that's rather difficult, right? Give me an account of what you believe about Christianity, right? Or about what's your worldview. You would have to think about that for some time, right? I think, to put it together. And if no one ever asked you what you believe, then it would probably be quite, I think, difficult for you to actually articulate it, right? Okay. Articulating it and taking the time to think about it are really key. All right, so sticky faith, right? That's Powell and Clark, suggests that children need their own faith, right? Just relying on the faith of their parents, I know I sound like a broken record, is not going to move people into sticky faith. That's going to be hemorrhaging faith. And Smith and Snell essentially back this up in Souls in Transition, their 2009 piece, saying that, internalization of religious significance, making faith your own, is just behind relationships in maintaining faith. Right? So number one is relationships, parents, peers, leaders, mentors, all of these things. And just behind that is internalization of faith. Right? So, I mean, that's a tricky one, right? That's number two. Number one is relationships. So relationships are super important. And right behind relationships is internalization of religious significance. All right, so such an important phase in becoming an adult, right? In moving, into from those teen years into those emerging adult years and kind of fully entering adulthood is separating from parents and forming your own ideas and beliefs. And we all go through this, right? And often, especially in the teen years, great contention happens in these particular moments. But it's really critical, right? It's really super critical. I can't stress enough how important and critical this particular thing is. You know, these are the years, adolescence, early adulthood or emerging adulthood is where you become the person you're going to be probably for the rest of your life, right? After which you don't change as much, right? Because your views sort of concretize and set themselves in stone. All right, so what Sorensen says is camp, both for, young campers, right? So people who are, yeah, campers, right? Campers. Yeah. Well, I don't know how else to say it. Campers. And young adult and emerging adult staffers offers a really interesting environment for doing this, right? They are away from home. And that's super important, right? Their parents aren't there. So that, at least temporarily, that sort of support and infrastructure of like relying on your parents' beliefs essentially becomes absent, right? It disappears for a little bit. Now, there's something to be said for this. It's a very safe space in this regard, right? Okay, maybe let's talk about the next 2 points, and then I'll make a little comment here. You're away from the expectations of peers and family, right? So you're away from your friends a lot of times, and you're away from your family, right? So all of those expectations that they have of who you are, what you do, your sort of quirks and all them things are gone, right? So in a sense, I don't want to say that people become a blank slate, because that's obviously not true, but they become a blanker slate, right? It's much more possible to potentially explore ideas and maybe reinvent yourself just a little bit when you're off at a religious summer camp. Right? Why? Because who you are at home, who your parents expect you to be, who you've always been. Your friends know you, your parents know you, your siblings know you. They have expectations and you have patterns of how you behave, and all that goes away for just a little bit, right? So yeah, both campers and staff members, right, especially young, like older teenagers and emerging adults who take leadership roles, said they're deeply able to explore identities while at camp. Now, the thing that I think is really important about this, or one of the things I think is really important about this, is that it's temporary, right? You remove that sort of infrastructure of the parents, right, and the peers and all of these things for a few days, right, for a week, maybe 2 weeks at the outside, for the most part when we're talking about religious summer camps, right? You remove all of that infrastructure. But for most people who go to camp, the security that infrastructure, of their parents, love and effective support, it's still there, right? They know they're going back to it. So it's not like you're sort of cut loose, but you're given just kind of like a moment where you can explore a little bit, right? Branch out, start essentially from scratch where no one knows you, and kind of branch out a little bit and just kind of try out who you are. Yeah, overprotection and enforcement of beliefs is not generally an issue at camp, right? People are willing to offer you space to explore a little, to be who you are, to explore maybe a slightly different articulation, according to Sorensen. So, what does he say? And I think this is super critical. The camp offers one of the few remaining places where young people can be in a safe environment and explore their identity away from parents, right? Where else can people do this, right? Especially free of a lot of like persistent peer pressure. Okay, right, because school has a ton of pressure, right? Your schoolmates are probably the people you're going to be around for a good portion of your life. They're your friends, you care deeply about them. So exploring identity can be tough with them, right? Parents too, right? Your parents have a lot of expectations of you as a teenager and emerging adult, right? They expect you to be a certain way, and they have values and things they care deeply about, things they want for you. They want you to be a certain kind of person. If they're religious, they probably want you to follow along in the family faith tradition, right? A ton of expectations. And camp, while it might be religious, it's still a moment where you can get away from that for a little bit, from um, those direct expectations, which I think is super important, right? It's a pause in kind of that family life. Now, I think this is super important for later millennials, iGen, and obviously, Gen Alpha or Gen Prime or whatever we want to call them. You know, iGen, Gen Z, Prime, millennials. Since they, as we know from Jean Twenge, right? So Jean Twenge's book iGen, one of the things that she noted, is that adolescents spend much more time with their parents, right? They have much less space to develop identity even away from their parents, right? When your parents know where you are 70%, 75% of the time and who with 65% of the time, right? You're being driven around by your parents because you don't have a driver's license, you don't have a job. You have fewer of these, you don't participate in clubs because you're Gen Z and you don't do that stuff. You don't do any kind of religious congregation or congregational based youth group because, again, Gen Z just doesn't do as much of that. It's all online. And so for millennials and iGen, it's a space that's really important because it's a place away from their parents, right? Where they are separated from their parents and those expectations of their parents sort of fade away for just a few moments, right? For just a few moments of life, they fade away. They're separated. They're not in contact. Again, leave the cell phones at home because, you don't want the reinforcement of those expectations. Okay, so another thing that the Sticky Faith study talks about is this idea, and here, I've got a quote from Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich was a very famous Protestant theologian. It's got the time stamp right down there. And one of the things that Tillich stressed was that doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's an element of faith, right? That's important. So what the Sticky Faith study sort of describes is that doubt is an essential component of faith and faith formation in emerging adults, right? In a sense, in order to internalize their faith, right, if they're going to have one, they have to, wrestle with the doubts, right? Like Jacob at the Jabbok River, wrestle with God in a sense, right? Yeah, so that's a reference to Genesis 32:22-31. But wrestling with doubt, right? Wrestling with God in a sense, right, is super important according to the Sticky Faith study, right? However, it's often taken as a threat, right, in emerging adults, right? That they are teenagers and emerging adults, that they might be questioning their faith is taken as a bad thing. What the Sticky Faith study sort of suggests, and I think Sorensen's research on camps suggests this as well, is that doubt and wrestling with those doubts and maybe expressing those doubts. So I was hard on Jordan in the last lecture, for his arguments about, can God make a rock so big God can't move it? But wrestling with those kinds of doubts is a key to internalizing faith, right? Those doubts, if they linger and if they're unaddressed, right, they can pull you away, right? We've seen that with the science and religion stuff, right? Unaddressed kind of doubt and epistemological problems can kind of pull people away from religious faith. But yeah, I mean, there is a really strong discouragement, I think, especially in the kind of post-Christian culture, post-religious culture that we live in. A lot of parents will sort of see, their young people expressing doubts as something ultimately kind of threatening, as something that's ultimately like, oh my God, they're gonna, dye their hair green and become an activist, right? Or something like that, right? I say that facetiously, nothing wrong with green hair or being an activist. but that I think is the fear, right? And so there tends to be a like tamp down the doubts kind of instinct, I think, in a lot of religious communities. And what Powell and Clark sort of say is like, look, this is entirely the wrong thing to do, right? That is part of the process of internalizing faith, is wrestling with doubts, you know? Like I said, like Jacob at the Jabbok River, man. Uh, all right. Hey, if it's in the Bible, right, it must be okay. Um, okay. Camp at its best, right, where it does a good job according to Sorensen, is a place where, teens and emerging adults, supported by faithful adults and other emerging adults, can explore doubt, right? They can try on and test out, tweak theological beliefs, right? They can ask questions like, how do I reconcile, my belief that, I don't know, just like LGBTQ people have dignity, and are special and I love them, with, my faith, right? Or questions like this, right? Anything like that, anything they're questioning, or, science and religion, or whatever it happens to be, right? I don't think you could fit all of the animals in the world on a boat. All of these sorts of things, right, can be explored in these places. So, I mean, I think this is important, right? It can be a place of authenticity, right? And I think we know, from what we've seen, that young people really value authenticity, right? That being authentic is really important for millennials and Gen Z, right? They don't want to cut off part of themselves, right? Think about the stuff that we learned when we talked about faith unbundled, right? They don't want to leave a part of themselves at the door, right? They value authenticity. They don't want to take whole packages of religious beliefs that don't seem authentic to them. They want authenticity. So important to them. So camps can be a place where they can express that, right? In relative safety. Um, and yeah, I mean, camps at their best, can. So I'll say one more thing. Again, people often find religious communities very inauthentic, right? One of the biggest complaints that you tend to hear out of young people is that everybody's a bunch of hypocrites, right? They say, but they don't do. They talk one way, or they come, in their nice suits to church on a Sunday morning, and they go home and their life's a mess, right? Or they're mean, or they're cruel. Maybe they're cruel to all sorts of people, right? Or kittens. I don't know. Who could be cruel to a kitten? Um, so a lot, the religious world can often seem very inauthentic, right? It's a bunch of phonies. I think if you've been a young person, you probably have felt this in some way, and everyone's been a young person, right? Okay, and yeah. So again, I think we know this from um, from Springtide and their work on Faith Unbundled. Authenticity is so important, especially to Gen Z. So Christian camp at its best, can be a place of acceptance, love, and authenticity where people are just themselves, right? Separated from the everyday, and that can be, that can be its strength.
So camps, and tech-free camps in particular, should be places where people should feel fairly free of the peer pressure that they experience, in their everyday lives, and especially in high school and college, and then the influences of popular culture. Now, that's not to say that camp doesn't have its own set of peer influences. Obviously, when you're at camp, you're being influenced by the people you're at camp with. So there's different sets of peer pressure, and certainly, there is anecdotal evidence that I've heard that at camp, some people will tend to put on that sort of religious clothing, if you will, and act like everybody else is acting because they don't feel comfortable not acting in a religious way. But the pressures are certainly different, and this matters particularly. Like if we go back to Kenda Chrissy Dean's kind of argument, when she talks about how all of this works in kind of real life circumstances for most people, there are aggressively secularizing forces at work in the world, right? Popular culture, peer culture, social media, all in a lot of ways are fairly aggressively secular. Lots of pressure, for people to become sexually active, to not be, religious freaks. The idea of being a Bible thumper or some such thing, definitely something that is frowned upon, in most peer groups. And those forces will tend to shape people in secular directions. And I mean, we've been talking the whole course, I think, about social bonds, the importance of social bonds, and the fact that, if someone moves in or out of a religious group, it's often based on the fact that they are, forming or losing bonds with certain groups of people. So I think we need to be cognizant of that, when we're talking about camp. Camp is a place where potentially stronger social bonds get formed within a religious community, maybe pushing a person in that direction. But it certainly is a place that's different and works against the sort of assimilation into a broad secular culture that people typically experience in their everyday lives. Interacting with people who say are either mildly religious or not religious or of different religions, all of these things, will tend to be counteracted, at least in that moment where people are at camp. So I think potentially one of the best comparisons we can make, I think if we carry Kenda Christie Dean's metaphor about faith as bilingualism and the importance of learning and absorbing that second language, what we can say at the end of the day is that camp in some ways it is sort of like faith immersion, or it would be like a study abroad term, right? Like a short one where you're sort of thrown into an environment where you have to speak faith all the time, right? Like go get yourself thrown in with an Italian family for 6 weeks and, make do with trying to communicate with them and see what happens to your Italian. Okay, so this is basically, I think what camp does, when we talked about Kenda Christie Dean, right, she talks about the limits of that schooling model, right? Whether it be like kids' classes during church or things like children's programs, youth group, there are actual limits in a lot of ways to these sorts of approaches. So basically, camp should serve at its best, hopefully, as a great place to transmit that religious knowledge, to really get people immersed in, in basically the language of faith. One of the things, that we can say about kind of normal everyday life when it comes to faith is in a lot of ways the model and the kind of that schooling information delivery model that we have is basically predicated on, communicating faith facts. Hopefully kids learn a bunch of Bible verses, learn a bunch of doctrine, and learning like these orthodox facts, like the correct way of knowing, should lead to correct way of acting. So orthopraxis, or the correct way of acting, the idea is you learn the right facts and you'll then become the kind of person that, Christian leaders ultimately probably want you to be. Diana Butler Bass. So Diana Butler Bass is a Methodist preacher in the U.S. And she's, been fairly active in talking about some of the models that churches adopt and where she thinks they're basically flawed. And I mean, she's a fairly liberal figure. If you look up Diana Butler Bass, she is considered by a lot of, especially conservative Christians, to be sort of a heretic. But I think, whatever you think of her theology, what I think is interesting is she says that basically the model of most churches today goes along the lines of you believing, behaving, and then belonging, right? So in order to become a Christian, say in an evangelical or Catholic congregation, you first believe, right? So you come to believe whatever the church tells you is the truth, and then you start behaving in the Catholic way, right? I say if you're converting to Catholicism, you go through kind of the conversion process, or RCIA. You get baptized, you get confirmed, you start taking communion, you go to confession, all of that fun stuff. And only once you have taken on all of those behaviors, and I mean, it doesn't matter what religious group you're talking about, whatever behaviors that they think are important, once you've done all of those behaviors, then you belong. And one of the things that Sorensen stresses is that camp really inverts this, right? That camp is a sort of flip of this whole model, right? At camp, everybody belongs. You just show up to camp, you're loved, you belong in your cabin, your leaders are going to treat you, as well as they can, hopefully. So everybody belongs at camp. You don't, and I've heard this at Christian camps, you don't have to believe to belong, right? You belong here just because you're here. And so there's no expectation that you will basically believe or behave right at the beginning. Now, camp will start with belonging, right? And then you're expected to participate, right? So you're going to go to the evening worship services, and you're going to go through at least some of those behaviors of faith. And then hopefully I think the hope for most Christian camps and most religious camps, I'm sure, would be that at the end of that process, you ultimately believe. And yeah, that immersive experience, right, is really important. You live faith every day for the full day. You learn that language of faith. You are immersed in it. Whether you're a young adult leader, like an emerging adult leader, or you're a kid going to camp, right? You're given free reign. You don't have to compartmentalize that faith that maybe people are bringing around, but they hide it when they're out in public or with their friends because they don't know how their friends will react to whatever their religious beliefs are. I think a pretty common experience. And so camp is a place where that compartmentalization can end, and you can just be yourself and immerse yourself in the language of faith. And therefore, like in an environment where people, arguably from what Smith and Denton and Kenda Christie Dean are arguing, don't have a lot of chances to use that language of faith in their everyday lives, camp can be that moment of really getting that religious vocabulary and practicing it in really meaningful ways. So one of the really important things, and especially for young adult leaders, whether they be teenagers, I guess, or emerging adults, the ones who go to camp to be leaders or junior leaders, one of the things that Sorensen really stresses, and I think this is inarguably true, that basically they go from being the objects of faith in a lot of cases, right? They have the programs designed for them, right? There's a youth group or a young adults group or some program that's basically aimed at building up their faith life, to the agents of faith, right? They become the ones who are working to pass on the faith to other people. So basically, they go from being a problem to be solved to the people who are, working on helping other people in their faith journeys. And, Sorensen, and I think rightly so, thinks that is a really important and really valuable thing that camp gives to emerging adult leaders, right? They get to practice those leadership skills. And, going in, having agency, not feeling like your faith is potentially something that was just passed on to you by your parents, but actually owning that and living that, experimenting with it, telling others about faith, right? I mean, if you're a junior leader or a young adult leader at a camp, especially for kids, telling kids about faith, that's kind of part of learning the language of faith too, right? Like it's like going to an Italian restaurant in Italy, or any kind of restaurant in Italy, I guess, and trying to order something, right? Practicing your Italian, or going anywhere and practicing that language. In this case, right, you're practicing telling people what your faith is and why they should believe it too, and why it's quite important. And camp, I think, can powerfully do that, and this is sort of where Sorensen comes down as well. Okay, so Sorensen identifies 4 factors that lead campers and camp leaders to growth in faith. And basically, he thinks that this is what a good Christian camp will do. Okay, so the first one, an increased frequency of conversations with cabin mates about God and about faith, right? So just talking about it more, getting to know that language of faith, really important. The more you get along well with your cabin group and your counselor, the more you'll grow in faith, right? So basically, they did some surveys of people coming out of a bunch of Lutheran camps in Minnesota. And basically what they found was when people liked their cabin leaders, like their groups, getting along well with them, they were treated kindly and lovingly by their counselors, they grew in faith, right? So that personal connection is super important. Those social bonds, right? Creating those social bonds with someone you respect and love, unbelievably important. And I just, want to stress that again because, I like to harp on Stark's theories all the time, as you can probably tell from me. And I think Stark is completely right about this. Social bonds is absolutely 100% the key to religious kind of relationships and to keeping people anchored in religion. And camp builds that kind of in an artificial setting, but the more you get along well with that group of people in your cabin and your leader, the more you grow in faith. So I think that's incredibly important. And then that last point, trying something new at camp, not related to cabin culture, the more people kind of put themselves out there and had fun experiences at camp, and in a sense associated a new experience and a fun experience with their experience of camp, the more they grew in faith, right? So camp just, again, gives you that chance to step out of yourself, and that ends up being really, really powerful.